Loud. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group and our book club for September. No, we're already in
October.
October 2022, right? But this is our first for this academic year if you're in the global north. And well, I'll start off saying hi. We're really excited to, after this break that we had for the summer in the global north, I suppose. No, not in the global north, above the equator. Right. We're happy to just jump back in and start back our sessions, right? So I'm joined by Renata Leitão and Mariana Braga from the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group. And our wonderful guest today is Arvind Lodaya, who is going to give us what he said is an old school presentation. And we are going to be looking at the book, How Much Should We Consume? Is that
What should a person consume?
Yes. Right. So, Arvind, I am actually just going to hand over to you. You can introduce yourself and then it's all yours. Right?
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming here and spending your time here. It's really a wonderful platform for me to get to know so many people. Just to give me a quick introduction, I am a designer by training, and I've and I live and work in India mostly for almost 35 odd years now after I passed out of design school. And I've had many kind of roles and avatars which I've straddled. I've been an industrial designer, I've been a communications designer, I've been a social designer, and of course, I've also been a design academic and educator as well. So in my current avatar, which is just a year old, I've just taken on a professorship at a new university in near Bangalore, India, which is where I am right now. And I've just weeks ago launched a new 4-year undergraduate curriculum, a new program in design, which is, actually the theme of which is horizontalizing design. In other words, it is no longer looking at design as a specialization, as a vertical, but more as a horizontal, which can actually embed itself and incorporate itself into many or infinite number of fields and disciplines. So the aim is to train students who would kind of, who can blend into any work situation, any work context really, and contribute value with what they learn in design school. So that's the experiment that we have just launched. I'm happy to share more about this with you later when we get into the Q&A. Let's get on with the book in question. So this is the book, and it's called How Much Should a Person Consume? And the author is a very well-known Indian historian and writer and public intellectual by the name of Ramachandra Guha. Interestingly, Guha in India connotes somebody from the eastern part of the country, from Bengal. That's a very common surname from that sort of part of the country, but he is not a Bengali. He is actually from the south of India, which is in the context of states, it is Tamil Nadu or Tamil, the Tamil state, and he's a Tamilian. And his name was Guhan. His second name was Guhan, Guhan, but somewhere in the school records or certification process, the N got dropped off and he suddenly got converted to Guha. And this is again sort of funny because this kind of stuff happens all the time in India. Documentation and certification and proof of identity is something that's very important, and you have to keep showing it everywhere. And of course, the official record keepers always mess up your spellings, or they juxtapose the surname first and the second name. Like my mother's surname has become a first name now because somebody decided to write it that way. So there's all kinds of crazy stuff that happens. Coming down to the book itself, the book has a really kind of fascinating title, and I was rereading it. I read it close to when it first came out in 2006. But now it just so happened that when Leslie and Renata got in touch with me about this event, I happened to have just read it at that point of time. So I thought it would be quite good for me also to refresh my memory and also to share this with you. So the first thing I need to share with you is that this book follows actually on a paper that Ram Guha wrote in 2003 of the same title, called How Much Should a Person Consume? for a journal called Vikalpa, or which is the Hindi word for alternatives. And it's a kind of alternative, as you can expect, journal from the social sector. And Ram Guha, is actually a historian, and he writes about many kinds of histories, including cricket, the sport cricket, which of course, as you might know, has a huge following in India, but was originally brought here by the British during the colonial period. He has also written histories of the environmental movement, and his PhD work actually was a kind of comparative history of environmental movements in the US and in India, and which informs a big chunk of what this book really is all about. So the book, although it sounds like it's a technical book, it's really about, it sounds like it's all about information and, how much statistics and data in terms of what should be the ideal level of consumption in order to sustain the planet and so on and so forth. It's not at all about that. So the title is a bit misleading. It's actually about the history of environmentalism as a movement or as an ideology in different parts of the world. The interesting part is, let me start with the last chapter. So I'll just read out the chapters list. The first chapter is called History sans, as in the French word sans, chauvinism. So history without chauvinism. The second chapter is called The Indian Road to Sustainability. The third chapter is 3 Environmental Utopias. The fourth is Democracy in the Forest. The fifth is Authoritarianism in the Wild. The sixth is The Historical Social Ecology of Louis Mumford. This name may be familiar to some of you. The next chapter is The Subaltern Social Ecology of Chandi Prasad Bhatt. This name may be familiar to those of you who know a little bit about Indian environmental movements. And so is the next chapter, The Democratic Social Ecology of Madhav Gadgil. And the last chapter is How Much Should a Person Consume, which actually is a kind of iteration of this journal article that he wrote earlier. I happened to get my hand on this journal article, and that also proved to be really interesting because it kind of shows where he was coming from and then how the article suddenly morphed into a book, combining perhaps with his PhD work, and he fleshed it out into a comprehensive book. But I also got some interesting tidbits which are not mentioned anywhere, but thanks to some detective work, I was able to unearth them, which gives some kind of a context. And this is a little bit of speculation, but not entirely. So for those of you who know that in the Indian environmental movement, there's a huge milestone protest that lasted for many years against a huge dam on the river Narmada. And that movement lasted for nearly a decade, because there was a mega dam, like a huge dam planned, which was going to actually submerge a very, very big part of the forest, forest area in the central part of India, where, of course, a lot of our indigenous people and forest-dwelling people have lived for centuries. So the submergence would have actually displaced them. So there was the state which was basically aiming for the electricity and water, irrigation and all the benefits from the dam. And there was a grassroots movement, which was basically about protecting the rights of the forest dwellers. And this went on for many years. There were many ups and downs. And eventually it went to the courts. And in the year 2000, the Indian Supreme Court delivered a judgment against this movement and basically sanctioning the construction of the dam and the submergence of that area. So that was a massive blow in some sense to many environmentalists in India. Soon after this Supreme Court judgment, the Indian writer, some of you may have heard of her, Arundhati Roy, she's a writer activist. She actually publicly took a stance against the Supreme Court judgment and in solidarity with the affected people. And she, as if you know her writing, she can be really, really powerful and almost incendiary in how she expresses herself, and she did so even at that time. And that was like a major, public event that happened at that point of time. Soon after Arundhati Roy made her statement in support of this movement, Ram Guha made a statement criticizing Arundhati Roy, and he basically said that she doesn't know what she's talking about. She's very emotional, and she should just stick to writing books. So which, of course, was really outrageous for many of us who saw this as patronizing, as gender insensitive, as all kinds of things. So my hunch is, I mean, I don't have a personal memory of that time, but I'm inferring that in the Indian alternative space, Ram Guha, who had until then had enjoyed a really high profile and respect and admiration widely, suddenly fell from grace and kind of became a black sheep for a time, for a short period of time. And I think that this book was, in a way, some attempt to kind of reclaim or explain his position and to his to people in general. So this paper that he wrote in 2003, followed by the book in 2006, I'm seeing this as a kind of attempt to make up and build bridges again with the social sector and the alternative sector in India. So that's the little gossipy kind of backstory to where this book comes from. Now, let me start with the essay itself, and that's the last chapter of the book, because I'm sure many of you will be curious to know what he really has to say about the question that he poses. So he starts the essay with that particular essay, with a reference to J.K. Galbraith, who's the well-known economist from the 1950s, like who influenced development policy very, very substantially in that period of life. In fact, Galbraith wrote a book similar to maybe what Ram Guha's book is like now, called The Affluent Society, and in which he basically put forth a critique of capitalism and this kind of obsession with growth as early as 1958. So he refers to that essay as a kind of trigger for him to write. And in that book, in that Affluent Society book, Galbraith followed it up with an essay which he published in 1958 called How Much Should a Country Consume? So Ram Guha has kind of referenced that in his article as well as in his book. And then he covers the kind of the ground in terms of the discourse around this ideal consumption, or whatever you want to call it. One of the factors, of course, that he traces in historically, because that's what he always does, he goes back to the history, is the so-called population bomb, which was like a big meme at that time. And a lot of the people at that time were concerned about how the developing countries, poorer countries, third world countries will actually, really fill up the planet and eat up all its resources. And that's the biggest problem that we are facing, and that's what needs to be. So he talks about how that argument came up and then subsided thanks to Galbraith and other scholars who essentially kind of disproved that whole hypothesis. Then he presents a very interesting categorization of his own. I think that's his own original categorization, which he evolved in collaboration with the Indian environmental scientist Madhav Gadgil. If you remember, one of the chapters is dedicated to the work of Madhav Gadgil. So Ram Guha and Madhav Gadgil proposed this categorization of three categories of people vis-a-vis in terms of environment, the attitude towards the environment, whom he calls omnivores, ecosystem people, and ecological refugees. Now, that I think is really fascinating. So, because he's basically giving us a new way of looking at society and attitudes towards consumption as well. The omnivores are, as he defines it, omnivores have the capability to draw upon the natural resources of the whole of India, whole of the country or wherever planet, to maintain their lifestyles. So they are the people who basically are so powerful and influential that they have basically control over all the resources, natural resources of that nation state. Ecosystem people, on the other hand, rely on resources in their vicinity. So they are basically small town folk or people with less access to power and influence, and therefore they're reliant on their regional kind of ecosystem for survival and to thrive. But the third category, the ecological refugees, are those ecosystem people who have been displaced from their homes and live in slums. So these are the migrants, the people who have been removed, unsettled by projects like the big dams and so on, and forced to migrate to cities in search for livelihoods and labor. And they become the free-floating labor force that countries like India have such a huge number of, which is hardly ever registers on all the economic indices, that the contribution to the workforce, the contribution to the economy never really registers on the radar, because most of their work is undocumented. They don't make minimum wage, they don't have very many entitlements, Their documentations also are really kind of inadequate, so they don't have access to citizenship services that they would be entitled to. So that's the kind of people who he calls as ecological refugees. So I find this really fascinating. And he, of course, I mean, as you can guess, he talks about how the omnivores are the ones that control the entire system and make sure that whatever changes happen, that they constantly actually meet their needs, that their needs never go unfulfilled. And this he keeps coming back to later on, which I'll also come back to down the line. Then he talks about the three approaches or three broad ideologies towards consumption, and he talks about the first. He talks about the conservationist approach, and here again he refers to John Kenneth Galbraith in the essay "How Much Should a Country Consume?" And he says that Galbraith in that mentions the single-minded pursuit of wealth had diverted attention and resources from the nurturing of true democracy. So he's also linking up democracy with environmentalism as fundamentally interlinked. Later on, he also connects it with feminism and other ideologies. But Galbraith defined it, democracy or democratic infrastructure in terms of public infrastructure, creation of schools, parks, and hospitals. So that is the provision of a social infrastructure is as much a part of the environmental the movement to him as democracy itself, the institutional aspect of democracy. But he quotes Galbraith again from the essay, says, if we are concerned about our great appetite for materials, it is plausible to seek to increase the supply or decrease waste, to make better use of the stocks that are available and to develop substitutes. So that's a classic kind of techno-commercial kind of logic to environment. But what of the appetite itself? So Galbraith in 1958 asks about the appetite for growth, the appetite for resources, as a fundamental ethical or moral question that needs to be addressed, not just the technical or managerial aspects of how to manage the supply and demand kind of equation, which is quite nice. And Galbraith in that time itself says, yet in the literature of the resource problem, this is the forbidden question. And I think this is the part that Guha has picked upon and actually elaborated extensively throughout the book, which is the question of why does nobody question or ask the fundamental question of how much do we need? And he, of course, Guha, one of the subjects of Guha's history writing has been Mahatma Gandhi. He has written extensively on Gandhi. He has published many books on Gandhi, even on India after Gandhi, as tracing the kind of effects of Gandhi on the Indian political discourse. And Gandhi, as you might know, was one of the first people who articulated the environmental question in terms of need versus greed. And he says that the earth has enough to support what everyone needs, all the population, all the living beings here need, but not to support everyone's greed. So he kind of keeps going back to that and says that is the question nobody seems to ask or even look for an answer. Where do we cut off? Where do we draw the line between need and greed? So he finds a connection with Galbraith in that article. In fact, Galbraith wrote this article even before Rachel Carson published her kind of epic book, Silent Spring. And then he says, as it happened, consumption continued to be the great unasked question of the conservation movement. So he also looks at Rachel Carson's work and says that even in her book, although she raised all the right questions, she still sort of skirted around or did not directly confront the question of putting a kind of cap on consumption or putting a limit on consumption. Instead, the focus environmental movement in the West, that is, starts looking more at issues like pollution and threat to wild species and wild habitats posed by economic expansion. And of course, that comes from a study of American environmental history, which is all about preservation and conservation and creating kind of reserved areas and protected territories, which is a wilderness, but does not question the other side, the urbanism and the actually impact on the sustainability of the planet. So he even refers to the dominance of the wilderness protection in American environmentalism has promoted an essentially negativist agenda, which is the protection of parks and their animals by freeing them of human habitation and productive activities. So that's something that he contrasts against the question or the challenges in India, where human beings have always coexisted with nature even in the most wild and remote regions. And it's really inhuman to actually separate the two. It's not that there are these vast open tracts of land like maybe we have in America, where one can put a fence around that whole area and actually declare it as protected and free of any human intervention. In India, humans are everywhere. And in order to create a kind of pristine space like that, you need to kick people out of their natural homeland where they've been living for centuries in the name of nature, in the name of conservation, which he says is absolutely wrong. So he essentially says that this is the fundamental problem or the flaw with the environmental movement. And even in India, there are lots of followers who have picked up on these ideas of creating these kind of pristine natural reserves or habitats without any human presence or intervention whatsoever. And he, of course, critiques them as well. Okay, I'm going to leave this for a moment. Yes, he concludes this chapter. So, where is his answer about how much should a person consume? He actually studies the German model, and that's what I think he is upholding to us as the kind of near ideal kind of formula towards finding the optimum balance. And he makes a reference to an institution called the Wuppertal. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. It's Wuppertal, Wuppertal Institute, which actually commissioned in the lost the connection here, in 1990s, 1998 and so on, a document or a report called Sustainable Germany, which was sponsored by the Wuppertal Institute for Climate and Ecology, and which for the first time acknowledges, from his perspective, as Ram Guha says, in the kind of Western environmental discourse, the fundamental premise that the North lays excessive claim to the environmental space of the South. And he quotes from the report, the North gains cheap access to cheap raw materials and hinders access to markets for processed products from those countries. It imposes a system, which is a reference to WTO, that favors the strong. It makes use of large areas of land in the South, tolerating soil degradation, damage to regional ecosystems, and disruption of local self-reliance. It exports toxic waste, and it claims patent rights to utilization of biodiversity in tropical regions, etc., etc. So he actually says that this is the first time that somebody in the North/West has actually, admitted to their complicity in actually creating the problem or bringing the problem to the brink of disaster. So that.
We lost your sound. Oh, okay. You're back. Yes.
Sorry. So can you see this? I mean, I'm just trying to show you this.
We actually can't. I've been told that we can see it if you put it by your chin.
Yeah.
Or can
so I'm just showing you that this is a strange kind of creature, a kind of tabular chart, which is almost like a scientific data in the midst of an article, which is actually like a political economic critique, maybe even socio-political critique, where he talks about the indicators or the targets that this Wuppertal Institute report sets for consumption of energy, materials, substance release, and soil erosion. So the standards that were set, which then he says that this is something, and he classifies this approach as scientific. Let me just find the term for it. So this is the third approach which he talks about. There's the one he talks about is the kind of so it's neither romantic or exclusivist, nor is it populist or the other way around. Basically, he's trying to find a middle ground between the conservationist conserve at any cost kind of a ideology of Western environmentalism, nor the approach of put brakes on development and let's regress back to nature, which is a kind of romantic naturalism, if you like, of another section of environmentalists. And he's advocating this third model, and this German example is what he's actually standing up for, which is what he would call scientific I don't remember the term for it. I'll get it for you in a minute or so. But it's basically scientific management of resources, but it is also underlined by democratic and ethical consideration. So that's the answer to the question: how much should a person consume? But that's only the last chapter of the book. Most of the chapters actually deal with history of the environmental movement in the West, particularly in North America and in India. Now I go back to the book. That was really about the article, which also becomes the last chapter of the book. Now I'm going to go back to the beginning of the book. And he opens the book with a quote from Eugene O'Neill, where this particular line, which is quoted, which is, "I was born condemned to be one of those who has to see all sides of a question." And I see this as significant in the context of Arundhati Roy and the history of the Supreme Court judgment, where he's protesting his position as somebody who can't just take a side for sentimental reasons or even for political reasons, but he is trying to be as objective as possible and trying to see and represent all sides of the question. And I think that's the significance of that quote that he has quoted. Let's go to the first chapter, History sans Chauvinism, in which he talks about, covers the most sort of the cliched position of environmentalists in the West. And he says, the Berkeley Nobel laureate George Akerlof once remarked of his fellow economists that if you showed them something that worked in practice, they would not be satisfied unless it also seemed to work in theory. This insight explains much about the dismal science, including why, as late as 1980, the MIT economist Lester Thurow could so magisterially write, and he quotes, if you look at the countries that are interested in environmentalism, or at the individuals who support environmentalism within each country, one is struck by the extent to which environmentalism is an interest of the upper middle class. And then he's put in italics, poor countries and poor individuals simply aren't interested. So that's what he chooses to kind of focus on in this question about history sans chauvinism. And he then sets about dismantling this whole perception that in order to be an environmentalist, first you have to be reasonably, well taken care of. You can't be starving, poor, in abject poverty and all of that, and still be an environmentalist in spirit, because that's not your priority. And that's the kind of Maslow kind of hierarchy that he tries to demolish and question. I think that's not the case. And then he pulls out several cases from Indian social history and from Indian colonial records dating back to the British times of how people coexisted with nature and have constantly tended or looked after nature and natural resources in their own regional contexts. Even in conditions which would be akin to poverty or underdevelopment. So he says he basically refutes this position, this Western perception, especially from economists, that there is no correlation between attaining a standard of wealth and then actually starting to care about nature and so on. And he talks about gives very interesting examples. Then he also intersperses it with his own scholarship, which starts with his PhD research, which he started doing on Indian forest movements, popular movements, which were like at the grassroots level and therefore led by local, what one would call uneducated people, but including, I don't know if some of you are familiar with the Chipko movement. Chipko is an Indian word, Hindi word, which means stick, cling. And that was the tree hugging kind of movement that took place in the 1980s, where the Indian Forest Department decided to set aside some part of forest near the Himalayas for logging and timber export and so on. But the local community that actually lived there and actually relied on the forest produce and were invested in its survival and thriving decided to protest against the machines and the logging by going, and the women led this movement by actually going and hugging trees, which actually led to a fairly large public outcry, and the whole project was cancelled at that point of time. So he gives examples like these to actually say that, to show that the assumption that you have to be rich in order to care for the environment is completely unfounded. And he's trying to talk, and he also is trying to, when he talks about chauvinism, so that's one kind of chauvinism he's trying to kind of distance himself from. The other chauvinism that he's also talking about is the kind of nativist chauvinism, which is where a lot of Indians like to believe that, in our traditional scriptures and in the Vedas and in the yoga philosophy and all of that, we always used to love nature and care for nature. And he says that is also chauvinism of a kind. And it's not true to say that, everything was so ideal and beautiful in the kind of ancient times, and people were. So he's trying to sort of, again, as he stated in the beginning, trying to strike an equidistant balance or critique from both the perspectives, both the extreme perspectives. What's fun is also to read about his journey through the course of his PhD work, which started out as being a kind of, at that time, ideologically a Marxist. So he started with a Marxist position, personal ideology and motivation, and that was the lens with which he looked at everything. But through the journey of his PhD, as he recounts, he sort of slowly developed a not hardcore Marxist or leftist kind of ideology, but started moving a little away from that. The next chapter is called The Indian Road to Sustainability, and where he looks at the history of the environmental movement even preceding the environmental movement, forest rights and forest conservation in India under the British colonial period. And he talks about how the whole colonial enterprise was really all about exploiting India's natural resources for industrial growth and development and production. And he also talks about, typical of him is to complicate the narrative by, not just allowing us to zero in on the good guys versus the bad guys, but to show the good in the bad and the bad in the good as well. So he also brings up people from Britain, scholars and activists who actually spoke for the kind of values that go against colonization itself. And he mentions John Ruskin, William Morris, and others as essentially people who actually were quite sympathetic to the kind of grassroots environmental values. He also talks about Patrick Geddes, Geddes. I don't know if it's Geddes or Geddes or whatever. Patrick Geddes as a very kind of profound influencer for many of these people who influenced Lewis Mumford, and eventually who in turn influenced Mahatma Gandhi as well. And in a way, so one of the many influences that Mahatma Gandhi drew on were some of these British artists and thinkers and ideologues. Geddes actually did prepared a manual on environmentalism and urban planning, and he actually came to India and studied ancient Indian cities which had existed for hundreds of years, and he was also very, very passionate about conservation of heritage. He was not in favor of redevelopment and destroying ancient monuments and so on. So, as he says, Geddes' approach to town planning was not only ecological but also participatory. Lewis Mumford was his best-known disciple. A hallmark of Geddes' approach was his esteem for every genuine material or spiritual value in the local heritage. Almost entire miserly reluctance to part with the least scrap of it. So how to cling on to and hold on to heritage as much as possible. He found much to admire and retain in the Indian tradition of town planning. If those of you are familiar with the work of Christopher Alexander, the well-known architect and designer who wrote like epic books like The Sense of Order and also Pattern Language and so on. So a lot of Chris Alexander's field work, which led to many of the books that he eventually wrote, were actually studying traditional village habitats in India and how traditional design, which is a kind of anonymous design, it's like a collective design, it's not owned by any one person, but it's like a collective wisdom, folk wisdom, in terms of both building and town planning, it thrives or gets handed down from generation to generation. This Patrick Geddes or Geddes seems to have also discovered that and actually admired it in some way. Then he talks about some Indian scholars as well. So that's the section. That's the chapter on the Indian road to sustainability. So he pulls out several historical figures, including also Rabindranath Tagore, who talked about living in harmony with nature and so on and so forth. Let me skip forward to the next chapter. The next chapter, the third chapter, is called Three Environmental Utopias. And this is where he actually, let me just move to the three specific utopias that he refers to. And again, here also he has some charts and diagrams, impressive looking stuff again, but to me out of place in a book like this. It's a history book, it's a story book. I don't know what this kind of information is being here, but I think he's trying to also speak to the scientist community through this book and not just to the social activist or the environmentalist either. He talks about three utopias. The first utopia is what he calls agrarianism, which is essentially it's the machine kind of philosophy, it's the industrial philosophy, and it's to harness and to actually dominate nature. The second one he calls primitivism, which is the kind of retreat or regress back to the kind of pre-industrial times, as it were, and going back to live with nature. And the third one, he has not named it here, but the third one is the scientific management piece, which maybe comes to later on. Then he goes to really telling us stories about environmental movements or agitations. The fourth chapter is called Democracy in the Forest. And there he talks about a lot of the research that he did in terms of the laws around forest access and forest control in the colonial period of India, leading to the post-colonial, which is the independent India period. And he talks about how the informal social organization around commons was replaced by a colonial regime, which really, gave itself the first claim or the first right over all natural resources, including forests, and made it outlawed people from actually accessing it or using it for their own survival or other benefits. Suddenly, the people were turned into enemies of the forest. So this kind of a split was created between the natural resource and people, which did not exist until now. And he talks about how that thought was carried forward even after India became independent, where one would have expected that independent India would restore the rights of the people to their natural resources and create a kind of enabling system of governance whereby they could be the custodians and stewards of their own resources. But that was not to be. Instead, the colonial kind of regime just replaced one set of rulers with another set of rulers, but the framework of rights and claims pretty much remained the same. And he again cites some really interesting stories about individuals who spoke against this and critiqued this, both from the Indian side as well as from the British side. In fact, he also talks about German forester called was brought in by one of the kingdoms which preceded independent India in South India, very close to Bangalore. His second name is Brandis. So he was the first Inspector General of Forests in India, and he was quite a visionary and very sympathetic to people's access and rights or claims onto the forest produce. But he was overruled by the new regime that had come in at that time, and they just went ahead and replaced, kind of replicated the British colonial system all over again. So he also regrets the fact that, even in independent India, the sort of the new power dynamic basically replicated the colonial equation all over again, and even ignored good advice from informed people, both on the Indian side as well as non-Indians or Europeans. So that's, I think, typical of Ram Guha. He keeps sort of complicating the picture and prevents us from jumping to making Europeans bad, Indians good all the time, and constantly points out that the picture was much more messier and complex in that time. The next chapter, number 5, is authoritarianism in the wild. And that then he comes to the whole conservation kind of ideology, which is about the World Wildlife Fund and these kind of international organizations which look at nature as a precious resource worth preserving, but which also play into the colonialist kind of ideology of devaluing humans and eliminating humans from their natural kind of and traditional habitats in order to conserve nature. So he makes a lot of sort of observations on the literature that came up at that time, and he calls it, what we have here is an ecologically updated version of the white man's burden.
Arvind, could we close and open for questions in 1 or 2 minutes, please?
Okay. Yes. Sure. I'm sorry, I just lost track of time. Of course.
No, it's right. It's great. It's been great. It's just that we have a time limit.
Okay, I understand. So then, of course, the next chapters are about these 3 individuals: Lewis Mumford, which we talked about already, who's the British kind of follower of Patrick Geddes, and who actually was a very sort of strong voice against rampant industrialization and so on and so forth. The second is Chandi Prasad Bhatt, who is an Indian activist who was the leader of the Chipko movement that I talked to you about, the tree hugging movement, and he was like a grassroots leader who came from the bottom. And the last chapter, the last person he profiles is Madhav Gadgil, who's actually a scientist, like a bona fide scientist, and who actually came into a policy role of advising the then government of India on a kind of conservation come democratic policy. So I think he's also profiling people, significant people in this context, before he goes to the last chapter of how much should a person consume. And I'm going to just find the third piece here, if I can, so that his preferred kind of framework or model, he's called it social ecology, which is like a combination of protecting people's rights and people's welfare, as well as natural resources and so on, by making them work with each other rather than pitching them as enemies to each other. So he talks about participatory democracy, he talks about process of natural resource use, which is open, accessible, accountable, political decentralization, so devolving power to the local community and the regional community, encouraging a shift to private enterprise. So he also has a role for private enterprise. He's not out and out leftist anymore. So he's saying that private enterprise is needed to produce goods and services, but also not over using or consuming the natural resources, and sustainable policies. And lastly, he says that the development model can only succeed if India becomes a far more equitable society than it is at present. So that's something that he concludes with. That's when he refers to the Wuppertal Institute's report in Germany and the targets that it sets. And so this is the concluding paragraph of the last chapter, which he says, as these divisions become more manifest, the global replicability of North Atlantic styles of living will be more directly and persistently challenged. And this is what he wrote in 2006. We can reflect if that is true or not. Sometime in the middle decades of the 21st century, Galbraith's great unanswered question, how much should a country consume, with its Gandhian corollary, how much should a person consume, will come finally to dominate the intellectual and political debates of the time. That's the book. All right.
Thank you so much, Arvind. That was so great.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, I guess Well, yeah, firstly, really, really thank you for sharing this book with us. I did not know this book or author at all. And, every paragraph, every chapter you describe, it's just setting off all of these little light bulbs, and making me think about questions that my own struggle with environmentalism where I am here in North America. I once had to co-teach a class on sustainability and the environment, and really was a struggle from day one because just the way the questions were framed from the perspective of the North American my North American colleagues really was that, okay, yes, environmentalism is for, yes, this upper middle class group of people. And then poor people could live how they want to live, but maybe they can't really do environmentalism the way that we do it, or, so I mean, this book, I bought the book in the middle of our talk so that I could go back and underline it myself, right? But I mean, right now we really open up. Anyone can just take the floor and either ask additional questions or reflect on what spoke to them during the presentation. So I'll keep quiet for a bit.
I'll jump in and speak. I'm brave, I guess. So thank you so much for your presentation. And I wanted to maybe ask a more critical question, because in the reading that I was able to accomplish, I didn't get to it all with my other responsibilities. But I got a strong impression that there was a lot of focus at the state level of systemic interaction and responsibility. And towards the end of your talk, you mentioned the discussion about private industry. And I wonder if there was any talk of commons management or cooperatives and more distributive forms of enterprise and shared models of ownership and governance, and what the topics, how these two topics might be in conversation. Is it really the job for us to redesign development, or is it already available to us in the claiming of institutions and organizations at a more human level of experience? Thanks.
Right. So that's actually pretty much the kind of expectation that I started reading this book with. I was hoping that he would actually be dealing with a lot of those issues, but it turns out that all he has to, in terms of prescriptions, are only in this last chapter, and where also it's a very to me it's not satisfying enough. It's not in depth enough. It's like a quick overview, which is tantalizing because it's got lots of potential, but he doesn't really sink his teeth into it or allow us to sink our teeth into it as well. So unfortunately, many of these ideas and topics that you mentioned, he does not actually deal with them specifically. He generally refers to them, and he has a kind of framework that he refers to like a green development strategy, which comprises of 6 kind of initiatives, which he talks about. But I think those are, to me at least, they come across as like just a first cut articulation and not really a deeply researched and developed point of view. So I agree with you that it's not as comprehensive as you would like to be. But just to remind you that Guha is not a technical person. He's not a scientist, a natural scientist. He is a social scientist and a historian at that. And his biggest asset is a storyteller. That is, he is a storyteller, and he really tells them amazingly. If you read the book, you will be unable to put it down once you start reading it. It's so well written, and he profiles individuals, and through that he gives us kind of certain ideas about what might and might not be the way forward. But it's on us to really infer it or to build on it. He doesn't do the analysis or the processing and give us the distillation that we would.
It felt like a bit of the mastery of linguistic skill that was presented was in comparative culture and maybe less on suggesting policy solutions or enterprise level solutions. So maybe that's the thing to walk away with or be proud of.
I think that the book is more about the question than answering the question, if you know what I mean. So he's just sort of set up the question for us and not really gone beyond that. And maybe he's sticking to his competencies. He's maybe beyond his depth when it comes to the actual kind of technical answers.
Mariana?
Yeah, thank you so much, Arvind. It was awesome and lots of information. I'm still processing. I will need to watch it again. And I was just, I think he made a very important point that is sustainability may be different to different peoples. And we have been perhaps studying sustainability in a very dominant mainstream, trying to propose things that do not work, and as usual, neglecting other ecologies of knowledge, as Britta corrected me here. And what I think is, this is so important. It is, there is no right solution that is going to fit everyone and every culture, every different peoples. And how can we respect and honor the knowledges that we neglect and contribute to sustainability as well? I think that is such a meaningful point. And the book talks about so many other things, or just this because I don't think we will have like perfect solution, and it is very annoying that like the healthiest people are the ones generating most of the impact or responsible for that and exploiting the land. However, we don't see this in reports and formal stuff, and things continue the same, especially in what we call developed countries. The logic is the rationale is the economics, who matters, who doesn't matter.
Yeah. I mean, my response to that is that I think he speaks to me as well in many ways, because as a kind of post-colonial subject, I also struggle a lot with trying to, keep this balance between being a kind of rationalist, sort of reasonable, science-based person, and at the same time, also trying to value the, traditional wisdom, and without getting overly sentimental or nostalgic or kind of reverse anti-colonialist either, in an extreme sense. So how to keep that kind of, ground in my head as well when I deal with these ideas is a challenge. I think in this book, at least, at least that's my takeaway, is that he seems to point us towards Europe, the European kind of intellectualism as perhaps the best that we have as available to us today as a planet, which is trying to kind of acknowledge objectively its own culpability in sort of, in creating the situation and aggravating it, and at the same time also giving us certain science-based benchmarks or processes which as a planet we could all agree on, and whose perhaps impact would be first and foremost be borne by the developed countries themselves. So it's not making the South the victim of environmentalism, but first turning the mirror on themselves. So that's what he seems to say. But again, this is 2006, so his scholarship is preceding the decade preceding that period. Since then, a lot of things have changed and are changing very rapidly as well. So I'm not so sure if the same holds true anymore.
We have time for one last question, so I think that's your question.
Well, thank you so much. Hi, Leslie. Finally, I see you on Zoom. So my name is Ting, and I'm from Connecticut. I joined the meeting a little bit late and I missed some of the presentation. But when I go back to see the book, unfortunately, I didn't read the book, but definitely I will, I promise. This book wrote in 2006, and after 16 years now, I mean, no matter in like political area, or even like a design area, we put climate change, I mean, as a like a main topic. So I'm very, I mean, in like a kids, from elementary school, even now, even kindergarten, because my younger son is in kindergarten, they already learned how to like protect the environment. So I feel in this timing, we don't need like a book to teach us how much we robbed from the earth, and how much we like hurt our like mother earth. But I think really needs to like tell them what could we do for, to repair this. And I think when I read some like review about your books, I saw those things. So I don't know, do you have a plan to write like a book for other like the new topic besides telling them how much we have done to hurt? Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm curious about
just to
your
clarify,
plan for
this
this
is not my
topic.
book. This is Ram Guha's book. So I don't know what his current thinking on this topic is and what he might have to say now. And I'm curious as well as you are, because I think what has happened in the period between the time he wrote the book and the wisdom which he put into the book at that point of time, and now is, I will say from my perspective that the significant shift that has happened is Elon Musk. Is a very different paradigm of the future has suddenly opened up, where suddenly the earth as it is becomes disposable, and we can now suddenly actually think about colonizing other worlds as well. Some of us, not all of us, obviously, and that is now a legitimate option on the table. Of course, all of us may not like it or agree with it, but it is an option on the table anyway. So I wonder what Ram Guha might have to say about that option in the current context as well. That's all I can think of.
And so thank you so much, Arvind, and everybody here who asked some questions. So we have our next meeting. It's going to be a chapter from Arjun Appadurai, The Capacity to Aspire, and I'm going to be the person presenting. I absolutely love that chapter. It was for me, one of the main reference of my PhD. So I hope you join us here. Leslie would like to say something to close one last thing, that the book club, we are trying to run by seasons, to stay in one part of the world by each season. So this is the South Asian season, and I'm so thankful to Arvind to open this new season for us, because we couldn't think of anyone better than you to do it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, well, again, thank you, Arvind. Thank you, everyone, for coming. If there is a book that you would like to present by an Asian, South Asian, you can expand the way you describe Asia and let us know, but reach out to us and tell us what's the book that you want to present, and we'd be happy to schedule you probably in the spring, because we have our schedule for the rest of the year. So look forward to seeing everybody again.
And if you have books also from East Asia, we can start to plan our next season too. That we are really open to open a new season about East Asia too.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day, and I will go and have a good
Arvind. Yes. Bye-bye. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Let me stop the recording.